What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
She climbed onto a chair like she was accepting an award, tapped her glass with a fork to pull every eye her way, and with that practice laugh that always made my mom melt and my dad beam, she said she was moving abroad for bigger things. Then she turned her head just enough so only I could see the wink, the kind you reserve for a private joke or a warning, and, because I knew my sister well enough to hear the message under the words, I understood she was not just announcing a move, she was announcing a hierarchy, hers being higher, mine being lower, and she wanted me to sit with that while the cousins clapped and the aunts teared up and someone shouted her name like a cheer at a game. I did not clap late or force a smile with gritted teeth, which would have been my old pattern, because I had trained myself to give her nothing she could throw back at me later, and I had been practicing a different skill these last months. The skill of shutting my mouth when a short, hot comment would feel good for 5 seconds, but would cost me later, so I kept my face even and my voice calm, and I hugged her with the same polite pressure she used on me, and I kept thinking bigger things. Sure, bigger things, say it loud and keep saying it, as if repetition turns it into truth, while I held inside what mattered, which was the fact that I was already holding a fuse that had been burning quietly for weeks. And I just needed to choose the moment to let the spark reach the fireworks. Amanda loved the stage that our family always built for her out of habit, and she knew exactly how to direct them, talking about opportunity and culture, and how a person has to leave small ponds to swim with real sharks. And I heard the little laughs people give when they think a sharp line is charming, and I saw my mother nod like she was hearing wisdom, and I watched my father squeeze her shoulder with that mix of pride and relief he always saves for her. And because old reflexes die slowly, I felt the familiar slide of being recast as the quiet one who should be grateful to stand near the glow, until another feeling cut in like a hand on the wheel. The memory of late nights and long calls and careful decisions no one knew I was making. The memory of saying no to a cheap shortcut when it would have been so easy to take it and post something flashy for immediate applause. And I focused on that because it kept me honest and kept me from taking the bait of the wink. I could tell you the history between us, the small digs that turned into running jokes that somehow always ended with me doing the cleanup, the way she used charm like a tool and never noticed who was holding the ladder. But I think what matters more is that she believed I would play my assigned part again, and it is funny how much strategy you can hide behind silence if you are willing to look boring in a room that loves noise, because while she described this move like a movie trailer, I counted backward in my head from the date I had circled in my calendar, the date I had kept to myself so carefully that even the friend who helped me test late at night thought I was overprotective. And the only reason I even showed up today was because I knew I could keep my mouth shut for a few hours and then go home and make one change that would turn her speech into a time capsule by morning. I felt the first flare of anger when she framed it like she was graduating and the rest of us were repeating the same grade, and I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to anchor myself, because I remembered the last time I let anger steer. When I blurted out something that made me feel strong for a moment and then led to a week of phone calls where I had to explain and apologize and fix, and I am tired of fixing other people's messes after they weaponize my temper, so I decided to let her have the moment, and I did something that would sound petty if I said it out loud, which is that I started taking inventory of who laughed loudest at the line about small ponds, because although I have stopped making scenes, I have not stopped taking notes. And notes are a form of patience. When the cheering died down and somebody dragged a playlist into the conversation, she wrapped her arm around me and did that mock whisper meant for everyone to hear, about how I should come visit and see how people think when they are not scared of big moves. And I smiled with my teeth and said I loved big moves when they are not just loud moves, and that landed the way a pebble lands in a pool, a small ripple and then gone. So I let the topic float away and helped my dad clean up plates, because being useful calms me, and I stuck it out another hour, talking to my aunt about nothing and my cousin about her dog, while Amanda worked the yard like a politician, and when I finally said I needed to head out because of an early call, no one blinked. Because I am the one who leaves early, and that is a story they like because it keeps me in place. I drove home with my phone on Do Not Disturb, sat at the table where I have been running my life for months, and opened the dashboard that has stared back at me like a dare every night this summer. And the cursor blinked at me next to a button I had promised myself I would not press until next week, because the plan was careful and the partners were aligned on that timeline. And then I heard her again in my head saying bigger things, and I saw that wink. That tiny flag she plants on my patience every time, and I understood that timing is not just about logistics. Timing is a message, and sometimes you send the message by moving the deadline forward and letting people wake up to a different map than the one they went to sleep holding. I pushed the date forward to tomorrow morning. I moved the embargo on the announcement with a short note to the contacts who matter. I confirmed the signed attachments were in the shared folder they had already been checking twice a day. I queued the landing page to switch from private to public at 6. I updated the list for the early access group who had been told it was coming next week, and then I wrote one calm sentence to the person whose name will carry weight when they post it first, letting them know the schedule change was not a mistake, and if they preferred to keep their post for next week I understood, which is a polite way to say I am not begging for attention, and I am not scared to go first without you. None of this will make sense to my sister tonight, because all she can see is the yard we grew up in and the applause that fed her since we were kids, and I am not taking that away from her, not out loud, not to her face, because I am done feeding the story that we are two sides of a fight that only ends when somebody breaks a plate, so I am doing something that looks like nothing, which I have learned is the best kind of something, and when she wakes in the morning, she will see what I have been working on in silence, and she will know that the wink did not land, because the fuse was already burning before she climbed on that chair, and by now the spark is inches from the powder. When I got home that night, I did what I always do when I feel the familiar heat climbing my neck and threatening to drag me into some loud mistake that will eat my whole week, which was to sit at the table with a glass of water, open the same folders I have been opening for months, and remind myself that there is a huge difference between clapping back and closing a loop, because anyone can throw a line in a family yard and feel 10 feet tall for an hour, but it takes a different kind of spine to keep a quiet promise you made to yourself on a night when nobody was watching and your phone had been silent for so long you started wondering if the universe had put you on mute on purpose. I did not grow this plan out of thin air or some sudden flash of genius that makes for a cute headline, and I did not build it to win a scoreboard argument with my sister, because if I had done that I would have cut corners and posted something shiny months ago, then spent the rest of the year chasing a mess, whereas this started when our grandmother's health went sideways and I watched my mother try to coordinate caregivers, invoices, medication notes, schedules, and endless callbacks while also pretending to be fine for the rest of us, and I remember thinking that we never talk about the paperwork part of love, the spreadsheets and calendars and reminders that pile up when a person you adore needs help. And I remember saying out loud in my kitchen that I was tired of systems that make good people feel stupid, so I started sketching a service that would make the logistics simple enough that a tired daughter could pick up her phone and know exactly who was coming, what they were licensed to do, what it would cost, and how to track what actually happened, and because I had been in admin roles long enough to know the ugliest choke points, I decided I would build around those instead of around some glossy demo that photographs well. People like to imagine there is a line between your real life and your so-called professional life, but the truth is you drag the same bruises into both rooms, so I kept my head down at work, I came home, and I taught myself the parts one did not know. And when I hit a wall I did not announce it, I kept poking until I found a crack, and little by little I stitched together a pilot. Then I started calling people who had buried parents while also paying for sitters and missing shifts, and I asked them what hurt most and what they would pay for if it meant they could go to bed without wondering if they had missed a form that would blow up the copay. And when they told me, I wrote it down and tried to solve that and not the fun problems. And then I called clinics and small agencies, and I told them they could try it for free if they would give me brutal feedback and a letter on their letterhead if it worked, and that is how I collected the signatures that are sitting right now in a folder that has my initials on it and a date that used to be next week and is now tomorrow. I have not told my sister any of this, because she has a way of rephrasing good news that takes the oxygen out of it, and it is not even malicious. It is a reflex that comes from being treated like the headliner for so long she forgets there are other instruments on stage. So when her fiancé Luke cornered me near the cooler earlier and said he keeps seeing my name pop up in his inbox attached to words like pilot and compliance and onboarding, and he smirked and asked if he should be worried about me giving his future wife a run for her money in the attention department, I laughed in a way that I hoped sounded like I had no idea what he meant, and I said he must be confusing me with someone else, and he laughed too hard for the joke. Then said something about investors loving women who say nothing until the last second, the way people on television do right before a twist, and he toasted the air like he was congratulating me on a secret he thought he had discovered, which told me 2 things I needed to know, that he checks her phone and that he thinks he can read me, and both are weaknesses, if you know how to treat them. The plan for the morning had been simple and clean because I wanted no moving parts after midnight, but I revised it with the same calm I use to fold laundry when I am angry, because action done slowly can be sharper than a shout, so I moved the embargo. I lined up a short announcement for the local business journal that had already interviewed me under a quiet name with no photo. I confirmed the nonprofit partner's post would use the sentence we agreed on about access and dignity and not make it about me, and I sent one last confirmation to the general counsel at the regional hospital network who had insisted my language about data was 3 words too broad, and I told him I had updated the policy and attached the exact line. And I thanked him for saving me from a headache I did not want to own, because I have learned that lawyers like to feel like they prevented a fire even if you already had a hose in your hand. I also did one thing that will probably make you tilt your head and ask if I was trying to be mean, which I was not, at least not in the way she would define it. Because I scheduled a private email to my parents that would land right before they usually look at their phones, and in it I thanked them for helping with our grandmother, and I told them I had named a small grant inside the platform after her. Not a scholarship with speeches and plaques, nothing grand, just a pot that will quietly cover the first few hours of care for families in our county who need a breather but keep putting it off because they do not know where to start. And I wrote that I hoped this would be a way to turn all the hours my mother spent on hold into hours someone else could spend resting, and I knew my parents would read that and feel something they have not felt about me in a while, which is that I've been paying attention in a way that does not set off arguments about who gets the front row. Around midnight I stared at the button again, and because I am not reckless, and because I will not let my sister's wink be the thing that dictates how I run my life, I went through the checklist one more time. I checked the wording on the landing page to make sure it was plain English with no jargon, because families do not need to be impressed, they need to be helped. I confirmed the early access codes. I looked at the list of support volunteers who had agreed to answer calls for the first week. And I sat with the thought that maybe Amanda was right in one tiny way, that sometimes you do have to step out of a small pond, not because there are bigger fish somewhere else, but because the pond you grew up in has a story about you that you do not believe anymore. And the only way to change it is to stop arguing and build something that makes the story irrelevant. Then I did the petty, perfect thing I had promised myself I would not do because it would look like grandstanding if anyone connected the dots, except nobody would connect them because nobody gives me that much credit, which is exactly why this works. And what I did was adjust the timing of the public switch to go live a few minutes before the time my sister likes to post her morning routine photo, that cute sequence she uses to farm encouragement when she is nervous about something, and I did it not to steal light from her but to stop pretending that I am obligated to dim mine forever to keep the room comfortable, and when I finally closed the laptop I felt steady, not hyped, just steady. The last thing I saw before I turned off the lamp was a new email from the partner with the largest name on the deck, short and clean, confirming they would publish the note at the new time and that they were proud to be first. And it ended with a line about looking forward to serving families who needed a break, which is the exact sentence I wrote on a sticky note the day I started this. My little act of revenge for the night was not a slam or a speech. It was locking the door on the plan so that by the time Amanda opens her eyes, the story she tried to write for me will already be in the past, and the one I wrote will already be the one everyone is reading. The morning after the barbecue, I woke up with that familiar mix of adrenaline and dread that shows up whenever I am about to do something that can change the furniture in people's heads, and instead of pacing or calling a friend to be told I am brave, which is never helpful and always tempting. I opened my laptop, looked at the checklist I have been living inside for months, and started working through the boring parts that make the loud parts possible, because if there is one lesson I took from years of being the reliable one, it is that reliability is not glamorous, but it is the only thing that keeps a thing from collapsing the second someone looks at it sideways. There were the predictable hiccups that come like clockwork whenever you push a launch even a day forward. The compliance guy who had signed off last week suddenly wanting a cleaner sentence around data retention because his counsel had a nightmare about headlines. The payment processor trying to hold the first transfers because the grant fund inside the platform looked like a donation product but was not technically a donation. The volunteer line needing one more person on the afternoon shift because someone's kid had a fever, and none of it was catastrophic, but all of it was the sort of friction that takes a person from steady to reckless if they forget why they are doing this in the first place. So I did what I always do when I feel my pulse getting bossy, which is to call people in the order that keeps the blood pressure down, to say thank you first and only then ask for the small thing I need, to change the sentence and resend the doc, to move the fund through the nonprofit partner until the processor confirms the category is good, to text the volunteer group and offer to cover the first shift myself if no one can, and to cross each item off the list without romanticizing the grind, as if it makes me noble rather than simply prepared. Right around late morning, Luke texted one of those friendly questions that is not a question, the kind where he says he heard rumors about me being up to something serious, and is there any way he can help make sure it gets seen, and the tone had that smooth, helpful flavor that men adopt when they want to be part of the story without admitting they want to be the narrator. So I thanked him, told him I was keeping things small until next week because I wanted to make sure families were not trampled by a rush of attention, and he sent back a thumbs up and a line about how smart it is to wait, which told me he will repeat those exact words to Amanda, and since he is the one who checks her phone when she sleeps, he will probably add that I am playing it safe again, and both of those ideas are useful to me because underestimation is a shield when you need a few more hours to lock the door. I went back to the work, and the work went back to being work, and then my mother called to ask if I could stop by in the afternoon because my aunt was dropping off the last of our grandmother's photo albums, and she wanted help choosing what to scan first, which would normally be one of those small errands I take on without thinking because that is my role in this family ecosystem, except the timing was ugly and my stomach tightened because I know what happens when we all sit in that living room. The conversation bends until it is a stage and Amanda steps on it even when she is not there, so I told my mother I would come by for an hour and then I would need to make a call, and I repeated the last part in the tone that means I actually need to make a call. And she said she understood, and I believed her even though I also knew there would be a script waiting for me when I arrived. The albums smelled like years and mistakes and the familiar ache of loving someone who made their life out of lists and receipts, and we were quiet for a while in the way people are quiet when they are touching old paper that holds too much, and then my aunt, who means well but lives for commentary, asked me what I thought of Amanda's big announcement and whether Europe would be impressed by her, and she laughed like she was teeing up a compliment about my sister's courage, and before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a new message in the family thread where Amanda had posted a little video of herself packing and narrating about taking scary chances while looking into the camera in that upbeat way she uses when she wants to cast herself as the main character of the entire zip code, and underneath it she had written a line that did not tag me but pointed at me, about loving your family, while also refusing to be held back by people who are comfortable being hometown nobodies, which is the kind of sentence that is meant to be motivational to strangers and surgical to the person it is really about. I could feel the older version of me rising up, the one who would type something mean and then spend a week apologizing to people who would never ask my sister to apologize for anything, and I swallowed it like hot tea. Because I have been training for this exact move, and instead of replying, I opened my laptop at my mother's table, checked the capacity settings on the platform for the third time, confirmed the early access codes were set to a number I could handle, and then did a small, precise thing I had planned but had not decided whether to use, which was to add Amanda's email to the first wave under a generic label so she would get the exact same welcome message that every family would get in the morning. The simple one with our grandmother's name on it and a short explanation of how to book the first hours of care, and I did this not to humiliate her but to remove the option she always uses when reality does not serve her, which is to claim she did not know about the thing until it was too late to be gracious. When my mother saw I was working, she asked if everything was okay in that careful tone that mothers use when they sense a storm and do not want to make it worse, and I told her it was more than okay, that I was just making sure something I had been building for a long time would do what it promised, and she looked at me in a way I do not see often, with attention rather than worry, and she nodded and went back to the albums, and that small nod was fuel, the clean kind that does not burn fast. And I took it with me when I left because I had one more call to make. I called the editor at the business journal who had been sitting on the piece we wrote under the quiet name with no photo, and I told her we were moving the post forward and that there would be a supporting note from the hospital network confirming the partnership. And she said she loved the angle about making logistics kinder for unpaid caregivers because it is a real problem and not a marketing phrase, and I thanked her and hung up. Then I copied the link to the draft article to my clipboard. Not to share it yet, but to hold in my hand like a steadying object, and I drove home without checking the family thread because I know the rhythm of those pile-ons, and I cannot afford to let my blood sugar crash over a sentence that was built to get me to swing. At home, I opened the dashboard again. I clicked through every setting as if I were trying to break it. I locked the final permissions so that nobody could push a fatal change by accident in the first day. And then I did something that felt like a little victory wrapped inside the larger one, which was to schedule a tiny push notification for the early access group that would go out a few minutes after the main announcement, not to boast, just to say welcome. You are not alone, here's how we will start, and I included a line that my grandmother used to say when she was frustrated with systems that treated her like a position on a screen rather than a person. And I felt the kind of calm you only feel when the pieces you have been moving in the dark start to click. By the time the sun went down, I had not responded to Amanda's video, I had not defended myself in the thread, I had not explained my plan to anyone. And the only petty thing I allowed myself was to change the subject line on the parents' email from the neutral one I had written yesterday to one that said their daughter had made something with their mother's name on it, and that I hoped it would make their lives a little easier. Which is not petty when you say it out loud, but in my head it was a correction to a story I did not agree to anymore, and I closed the laptop with the quiet happiness of a person who has chosen their lane and paved it themselves. The last thing that happened before I slept was a private message from Amanda that landed without a greeting, saying she hoped I watched her video and that she meant what she said about outgrowing hometown noise. Then a line suggesting I could visit once I was ready to see how people operate when they are not scared, and I stared at the words long enough to feel my heartbeat slow. Then I replied with one sentence that said I was not scared and that I had already committed to something that would keep me busy in the morning, and I put my phone face down, because when her alarm goes off and she reaches for that routine selfie, she will also reach for something she did not plan, a message with her name on it and our grandmother's name too. And it will be the first time in a long time that the script she loves most does not have a role for me. The thing about my sister is that she has always known how to play an audience. Whether that audience was two parents desperate to believe one of their kids was destined for something grand or a full backyard of relatives looking for a story to gossip about on the drive home, and so it did not surprise me in the slightest when, instead of settling down after her announcement at the barbecue, she doubled down the next few days with a steady stream of posts and calls and updates designed to remind everyone that she was, in her own words, stepping out of the shadows and into a world that would finally appreciate her brilliance, which, if you know Amanda, you know is the kind of phrasing she rehearses in her head for weeks before she unleashes it. Just so it lands with that mix of bravado and faux humility that makes people clap without even knowing why. She filmed herself packing shoes and made a 10-minute video about the symbolism of letting go of her old ones because they represented the small life she was leaving behind. And I watched it once because it popped into the family chat, and my mother commented with a crying emoji about how proud she was, and though I wanted to type something sharp, I reminded myself that the point of strategy is to control when you move, not to flinch every time somebody else waves their arms. Amanda even called me that evening in one of her magnanimous moods, the ones where she pretends to want my advice, but is really fishing for another opportunity to frame herself as the brave one. And she said she hoped I wasn't hurt by her comments about hometown nobodies because she didn't mean me. She meant people who never try anything, and then she added that she knew I had been working on something techie, and that maybe someday it would be big enough to get me out of here too, which was her way of stabbing me while pretending to patch the wound, and I bit down on the inside of my cheek and told her I was glad she was excited, because sometimes the best revenge is letting someone think they are speaking from a throne that is really just a chair balanced on a shaky floor. At the same time, behind the curtain of my calm voice and polite nods, the machinery I had been building for months was now turning in real time, and every gear that clicked into place was louder in my head than her endless self-promotion. Because the hospital network confirmed their public note would go live on schedule, the nonprofit sent me their draft announcement with our grandmother's name spelled correctly and respectfully, and the business journal told me they were ready to publish. First thing in the morning with a quote that sounded less like a fluff piece and more like a validation of what I had been screaming into spreadsheets for a year, except now someone with reach was going to say it out loud. And all I had to do was stay patient while Amanda performed her grand finale without realizing that the lights were already being lowered on her show. The real test of my self-control came the night before the launch when she organized a farewell dinner at my parents' house, not because she actually cared about saying goodbye, but because she wanted one last round of applause before boarding a plane. And I knew if I skipped it the story would be that I was jealous and bitter, so I showed up, sat through her toast about taking leaps of faith, listened to the cousins gush about how brave she was, and nodded when my father said he was proud to see one of his daughters chasing the horizon, which was the kind of line that used to cut me, but this time it only rolled off because I knew something he did not yet know, which is that tomorrow morning his phone would buzz with a headline about his other daughter. The one who never asked him to clap, but who had built something he could actually use if life ever put him in the same position as our mother. Amanda, of course, couldn't help herself and made another comment meant to sound playful but designed to sting, saying how she hoped I would come visit her abroad so I could finally see how people live when they aren't scared to take chances. And she did it with that same look she gave me at the barbecue, the look that says, "Stay small so I can stay big," and while a part of me wanted to fire back with a reveal right then and there, I reminded myself that the sweetest moment of justice is not when you cut someone off mid-speech, but when they finish their act and the applause fades, and they realize they are no longer the main event. So I smiled, I raised my glass, I wished her all the success she claimed was waiting for her, and I even hugged her on the way out. Not because I felt warmth, but because I wanted the memory of that hug to sit in her mind when she woke up the next morning to a world where my name was on screens she had no access to. A world where the thing I had built in silence was finally louder than all her speeches combined. When I got home, I didn't go straight to bed because I was too wired, too aware of how close I was to the moment I had been training myself to handle. So I checked the dashboard again, I refreshed the embargo settings, I reread the messages I had queued up, and I forced myself to leave them alone because the work was done, the systems were locked, the partners were ready, and there was nothing left to tweak except my own nerves, which are always the messiest part of any launch. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought about every time I had been underestimated, every time Amanda had told a story that made me the supporting character. Every family dinner where I kept my mouth shut because I didn't feel like cleaning up the fallout later, and I realized that the silence I had hated for so long had been my best weapon, because in that silence I had been able to build without interference, without sabotage, without applause that would have pushed me to release something half-baked just to prove her wrong. By the time I finally closed my eyes, the thought that carried me into sleep was simple and steady. She believed she had delivered the final word, but by the time her alarm rang in the morning, her word would already be buried under mine. And it would not be loud or flashy or self-congratulatory. It would be something stronger, something that did not need her approval to matter. And that, more than any witty comeback I could have thrown across the dinner table, was what made me smile as I drifted off, knowing that Amanda had just given her biggest performance yet. And tomorrow she would discover that the stage she thought she owned had already been dismantled while she was still standing on it. The phone buzzed on my nightstand before the alarm because the business journal pushed the piece early, and I lay there for a breath and listened to the tiny rain of notifications land on the dresser like a quiet drumroll. Then I sat up, opened the link, and saw my name in a headline that was not trying to flatter me or turn my life into a lesson, just stating that a new service for family caregivers had launched with a hospital network partnership and a nonprofit grant named after a woman who raised daughters that learned how to do hard things without applause. And in that same minute, the hospital account posted their confirmation. The nonprofit posted their welcome. The early access group got their message with the simple steps and the little line from my grandmother that made me swallow hard. And the dashboard began to tick with first signups from our county and the next one over, which told me this was not just a nice idea. This was a need finally being met. By the time I brushed my teeth, my mother had sent 3 texts that were just words and tears written out in full because she knows my preference for plain language when it matters, and my father called and did something he almost never does, which was to skip advice and skip questions and go straight to a sentence that will sit inside me for a long time, saying he was proud of me not for the announcement or the partnership or the name in a headline, but for building the thing I always said I would build even when it looked like nothing from the outside, and he asked how the grant worked and whether local families could use it when they were on the fence about letting a stranger in the door, and I told him exactly how it worked. And I heard him exhale in a way that made me think about all the times he has carried worry behind a quiet face. Then the part 1 had timed like a petty little symphony landed right on cue, because Amanda posted her routine selfie with her usual line about pushing past fear. And within a minute, the comments under it shifted to links to the article and the hospital note and the nonprofit post, and I watched her try to keep her caption on track while the conversation under it rerouted toward me. Not because I asked for that or needed it, but because the room had changed shape overnight and she did not have the map, and a second later Luke texted me privately with a generous offer to amplify my launch through their channels when I was ready, which would have sounded helpful if I had not already seen his habit of recentering everything he touches. So I thanked him and said we were focused on serving families first and attention second, and I meant every word because the difference between a show and a service is that a show can wait and a service cannot. Amanda called right after with a voice that was trying to be light and failed, asking when I was going to tell her about this and why I moved it forward without letting the family celebrate properly. And I told her the truth that I had told myself 100 times in the quiet, which was that I did not build this to be celebrated. I built it to be used, and that this particular morning was not about her or me. It was about the daughter who had been awake since 4 trying to figure out how to get coverage for a parent so she could go to work without hating herself, and if she wanted a party, I wished her well with the Bon Voyage dinner I had already attended. But I would not pause a service to spoon-feed a storyline that only exists to protect someone else's comfort. She tried a different angle then, saying she was proud of me but disappointed I had chosen to overshadow her, which is the kind of phrasing that has always worked on me because it wraps control in concern. But it did not land this time because the data on my screen was louder than her script, so I told her I had added her to the early access list and that she would be getting the same welcome message as every other family. And if she wanted to support me, she could start by reading it and understanding what we actually do so that the next time she spoke about me it would not be a vague compliment followed by a backhand. And there was a pause on the line long enough for me to picture her blinking through a set of reactions she could not settle. Then she said she hoped we could still be sisters, and I said we were sisters either way, but that I was done being her stagehand. And I ended the call because the volunteer line lit up, and that was the only stage I was interested in. The first calls were the kind of calls I had designed for and feared anyway. A son trying to understand how to schedule a short block of care without getting trapped in a long contract. A woman asking if she could use the grant for the first visit because she could not convince her parent to try unless she could say the word free in an honest way. A tired nurse from a clinic that had seen our post and wanted a walkthrough because their discharge coordinator was drowning, and I felt my hands steady as I answered, because this was not theory anymore. This was the work, and every time I hung up I could hear my grandmother's voice the way it always sounded when she said, "We are not here to be impressive, we are here to be useful." My parents came by around midday with a small bag of pastries because my mother manages anxiety by feeding people, and they stood in my kitchen and asked me to show them the grant page. And when my mother saw her mother's name there, she put her hand over her mouth and then on my shoulder, and she did not say anything for a moment, which for her is a speech. And my father asked if they could make the first little deposit for the fund even if it was symbolic, and I said yes, because it mattered to them to put their names beside mine in a way that did not involve clapping. Amanda did not post for a few hours, which for her is a long silence, and when she finally did, it was a short note about being proud of her sister and about families needing support, and there was no tag and no wink and no line about small pawns. Just a sentence that did not try to be the center of anything, and I took that as a win, not because she had learned a permanent lesson, I am not naive, but because on this day she had been forced to live inside my reality rather than insist I step into hers. Late that night, when the dashboard had settled into a steady rhythm and the volunteer chat had turned into practical jokes, because that is how people keep going when the work is heavy, I sent one last message in the family thread with the link to the grant and a note that said families in our county could book their first hours without cost if they needed a break and did not know how to start. And I did not add any link to the article or any quote about vision, because the point was never to impress them. The point was to change what happens in our house and houses like it, and if that change also rewrote the story my sister has been telling about me since we were teenagers, then that is not cruelty, that is correction. I turned off the light and lay there in the quiet, not rehearsing comebacks or victories, just breathing and thinking about how many people were going to sleep a little easier because their morning would not involve a dozen calls and a spreadsheet they hated. And I understood that the revenge I wanted had already happened in the cleanest way possible, because I had refused to fight on a stage and had built a room instead, and once people were in that room, the stage outside did not look as big as it used to, and whether Amanda ever admitted that out loud ceased to matter, because the point of a master plan is not the confession, it is the shift, and that shift had already taken place.